Ever since the 1640s, Japan has isolated themselves from the rest of the world in order to maintain their cultural purity and to prevent contamination from the Western world. But in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States sailed to Tokyo Harbor with gunships, forcing Japan to open up trade with the US, giving Japan a glimpse of their culture. Japan's rapid urbanization and industrialization brought great change to the agrarian society Japan once had and forced farmers to look for work outside their country. The first batch of immigrants from Japan arrived to Hawaii between 1885 and 1895 and managed to get hired to work in the sugarcane and pineapple fields. As the Japanese immigration occurred, they were faced with a variety of discrimination from the American people, similar to what the Chinese faced, which ended up the ratification of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. America's gaze of the Japanese immigrants in the mid-19th century was not of a positive outlook. Immigrants from around the world who migrate to America maintain their culture and identity. However, many Americans looked down upon all immigrants and were considered racially and culturally inferior. The media created a variety of political cartoons aimed at the Japanese culture, viewing them as sinister and foreign to Americans. Their clothing, style, types of food consumed, and their dialect was looked down upon and shamed. They were not only shamed upon but were viewed as a threat to the American nation. However, Japan's victory over the Russo-Japanese War completely changed the outlook America had on Japan as a third-rate country with no military influence. Now America developed the idea of the Yellow Peril, which they feared that Japan might extend their political and military influence on the American nation, causing disarray. This ideology spread like wildfire. In the morning of April 18, 1906, the earth was foreshocked with sufficient force to be felt widely throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. The earthquake occurred momentarily after and caused a total destruction to the city of San Francisco. The 7.7 earthquake was deemed one of the worst urban disasters in history, causing thousands of casualties. Despite this horrid incident, the Asian immigrants were able to benefit from this situation. The fires that spurred from the earthquake destroyed immigration records, which enabled them to claim citizenship and to bring their family members to the country. Additionally, fear over Asian immigration grew after the earthquake as this event sparked mob violence and aided in the segregation of public schools. On October 1906, the San Francisco Board of Education has officially announced that the city's Japanese school students in the public schools will be taught in racially segregated schools and they will be relocated to the Chinese primary school. The Japanese government protested that this was a violation of the Treaty of 1894, where it guaranteed the Japanese rights to immigrate to the United States and to enjoy the privilege as a U.S. citizen. In an effort to maintain diplomatic relations with Japan, President Theodore Roosevelt sent Commerce and Labor Secretary Victor Metcalf to San Francisco as an attempt to rescind their decision. However, Metcalf's effort was in vain as the San Francisco School Board refused to consider changing their segregation decision. This forces Roosevelt to restrict the immigration of Japanese laborers to the United States and prepare the U.S. Navy for possible attacks if hostilities escalated. During the midst of the anti-Japanese sentiment, the Asiatic Exclusion League was formed, who was made up of powerful labor leaders such as Patrick H. McCarthy, the general president of the Building Trades Council of San Francisco, and Andrew Furhuseth. The group revolved around the idea of a white man's country and the prohibition of Asian immigration. They were formerly known as the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League, but the members wanted to expand on their name to include all Asians and people from India, thus the Asiatic League was developed. The exclusionists did not represent the white population, nor were they able to shape the legislation as the group was perceived as fearmongers, who put their own interests above the national interest and diplomacy. Therefore, the group was taken far more lightly than they expected. Nevertheless, the group managed to play a key role in the meeting between the US and the Japanese that led to the Gentlemen's Agreement in 1907. As a result of the discrimination, the Japanese faced daily President Roosevelt resolved the situation knowing that the whole country didn't represent the California's philosophy. It wanted them to remove their segregation policy. The US and Japan communicated through a series of notes that eventually led to the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907. It was an informal agreement where the United States would not pass laws restricting Japanese immigrants, and Japan promised to not issue passports to their citizens unless they were going to Hawaii. However, there were downsides, such as the agreement was never ratified by Congress and the two parties relied on each other's trust to ensure that the agreement was enforced. Despite this, the citizens in Japan managed to get passports to neighboring countries such as Canada and Mexico as a passage to eventually move to America. Shortly after a gentleman's agreement, there was a system that would allow men in the United States to send photographs of them to matchmakers who in return find potential brides and would be sent to a one-way trip to the US to marry. This came to the picture bride system where it encouraged marriage and gave Japanese men to start families in the US. Its purpose was to build a positive reputation of their people and prove to America their social worth. The only downside to the system was that the Japanese men sent photographs of when they were young and attractive, which the brides didn't know until they met face to face. As the Japanese workers became more and more successful over the past decades, they thought it was time to expand on the horizon by buying their own land and starting a farm. However, it was perceived as a major threat to the white Americans. The state of California acted by passing the Alien Law Land of 1913 in response to the voters' strong anti-Japanese sentiment. The Alien Land Law made it illegal for immigrants to be citizens and own or buy property, creating a barrier for Asian Americans. One of the targeted victims to the land law was Fred and Kahiro Oyama. Fred and Kahiro were Japanese immigrants who were deprived of the land and they bought, as well as being forced to leave their home. The two family members would lead to the Supreme Court, also known as the Oyama versus California case, in 1948. The Supreme Court ruled that the state had violated their rights and property and contrary to the Fourth Amendment. While it did not end the Alien Law Land Act upon them, it did lead to the important asset for it to be repealed in 1956. Eventually, the Immigration Act of 1924 had been established. The Immigration Act of 1944 was to eventually hinder the number of Japanese immigrants to travel to the United States. The Immigration Act had provided 2% of the population that had their own national identity visas. This, however, had excluded the Asian population due to the Chinese Exclusion Act. The United States has also enacted a literacy test policy in order to limit the immigration from entering the United States. In the inauguration of President Warren Harding, the act was eventually renewed. The Immigration Act had also made that the Japanese were never allowed entry to the United States. This had offended many of the Japanese citizens that led to the many protests, but they were eventually silenced. This act may well have caused many strained relationships between the US and other European countries. While the two countries had a strained relationship with each other, their past would eventually be disregarded. In present day, the United States and Japan are now tied together as allies with a closer relationship. They began to be trading partners in the late 90s and would start to support each other. One primary example will be Taro Aso, Japan's former prime minister, who came to the White House in 2009 as the first foreign leader to do so. President Obama stated as the testimony of the strong partnership between the United States and Japan. It was also implied that their relations would be a key role in stability and prosperity of Asia and around the world. Similarly, Japan displayed positive aspects of this as they said it would be a cornerstone of their efforts around the world. Their new relationship would not just affect them economically, but socially as well. In this dilemma, Japan has endured many harsh conditions and had truly taken a stand for what they had believed in.